Well, thank you very much, Juliana. I am delighted to be back here at the ALA. One of the things that always excites me is that this is one of the few audiences where I really don't have to explain things. I also have to say that the ALA has been a very important part of my own intellectual growth. I see a lot of people here who were founders of the association. Some of them are moving towards retirement, which is a big mark of, as it were, the growth of the field. I have found myself in the last few years talking about the 50th anniversary of different texts, all the way from Things Fall Apart to Song of Lawino, a constant reminder, of course, that I too am about to get to that part when one starts to take the long journey to Pagak, hopefully not too soon. I am delighted to be here, especially this particular conference, because it's an affirmation of the centrality not only of Africa within the project of world literature, but most importantly, it calls attention to the richness and complexity of African languages. I've been going around looking at different peoples and their languages, especially the people I know, and I've been counting so many languages. I've already counted like 12 Nigerian languages. I've counted like 8 Kenyan languages. I've counted 6 Ugandan languages. I've counted maybe 4 or 5 Cameroonian languages. And this is just day 2 of the conference. So Africans are indeed the language people. I've called my presentation today, African Literature in the World, Imagining a Post-Colonial Public Sphere. And there are 2 parts to the presentation. The first part will try and locate Africa within the debates going on about world literature, questioning and calling attention to some of the problems of the terminologies we seem to have inherited. And the second part of my paper will call attention to the role of African literature in the last 50 years in the production of a post-colonial public sphere. I was going, especially in the last part of my paper, to play around with some African languages, but then I realized I was in trouble when I started seeing the natives of those languages yesterday. So I'm just going to put them up there, and you can read them. So this is the first part. Lately, there has been a lot of talk about the project of world literature, and occasionally some debates on the location of African letters in this edifice. Historians of world literature, a project often defined by an unquestioned European genealogy, including an English and French point of origin, have been wondering which texts and traditions belong to what Pascal Casanova has called the World Republic of Letters. Scholars of world literature, especially those committed to its diversity and diffusion, have been agonizing over whether there are literatures from the global south in general and Africa in particular that can qualify for admission into the Republic of Letters. Questions have been asked about the criteria of admission. Can literature produced in the periphery of the world system meet the standards established by the high priests of world literature, all the way from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in the early 19th century to the recent advocates of world literature in the 21st century? To be fair, intellectuals who take world literature seriously understand that the legitimacy of the project depends on its capaciousness and inclusiveness, its ability to provide modalities that are as comprehensive and as diverse as the world itself. In this context, one cannot but admire the drive for plurality and planetariness involved in the project of world literature. The criteria for world literature set by David Damrosch at the beginning of his influential book, What is World Literature?, seems to set a fair standard. Damrosch says, I quote, a work enters into world literature by a double process. First, by being read as literature. Second, by circulating out into a broader world beyond its linguistic and cultural point of origin. A given work can enter into world literature and then fall out of it again if it shifts beyond a threshold point along either axis, the literary or the worldly. Damrosch's criteria seems to be democratic, diverse, and inclusive. He seems to suggest that so long as a text is read as literary in its identity or in its self-conception, and so long as this text can travel outside its linguistic and cultural boundaries, it's licensed to enter the edifice of world literature. In this case, one can assume, maybe naively, that almost all African texts belong to world literature. After all, African literature, by its very nature, comes into being aware of its literariness, its expansive cultural and linguistic geography, and of course, its sense of the world. Often forced by circumstances to account for its identity and legitimacy in relation to the languages of empire, regional lingua francas, or even transnational geographies, African literature has always deployed the literary as an instrument of making sense of its location at the interstices of globality, or as Ngugi wa Thiong'o would call it, a globalectic vision. Even when it's located in a very specific cultural setting, the African text adopts the world as its mode of operation. Its engagement with the metaphysics of locality is always connected to the global ethnoscape. In fact, classical African texts from Sudiata and Inkishafi in the early period to Okotbi text Song of Lawino and Mariam Abbas Silong Lettre in the post-colonial period are driven by the desire to project literariness outside specific cultural geographies through gestures of linguistic and cultural translation. Sudiata, for example, is a text of Old Mali, but what makes its different iterations and versions compelling is its referential relation to Malinke, the Malinke world which crosses national boundaries, and how it's connected to other geographies in West Africa and the Sahel. To use another example, the Swahili poem El Inkishafi is about the fall of the Omani dynasty on the East African coast, but it's also a Swahili text that's written in the Arabic script, and one whose points of reference and poetics point to the cultural lines that conjoin the Old Kingdom of Pate, the Gulf of Oman, and the expansive world of Islam, not to mention Persian poetry. Song of Lawino was originally written in Asholi, but its various translations have been able to reach audiences far removed from the northern Luo culture of Uganda. In its various forms, the poem invokes a world, and this word world is a key term in all these works I'm mentioning, but the world is also a place in which there is always a struggle or an attempt to define and redefine the lived experience of the African as a citizen and a subject. And of course, the point I'm making here is that all these texts are very connected to a very local metaphysics, but by the same time, they are also connected to very expansive words through acts of cultural and linguistic translation. The question, of course, is if African writing easily meets the criteria for world literature established by Damrosch and others, why is it always absent from the major discussions and anthologies of world literature? Why isn't the literariness, the cross-cultural identity, or the worldliness, or even the translatability of these African texts, why isn't this a guaranteed passage into the World Republic of Letters? Or to ask the question another way, why aren't the continuous transference mechanisms of this literature not enough for it to be admitted into the literary kingdom? Or, to put it even in another way, why is the world literature and the world literature establishment, why is it afraid of African writing? What is it that this thing called African literature seems to threaten? In a sense, I would suggest that we need to ask that question. What is it that African literature threatens, much more than asking the question of how can we make African literature part of world literature? Because an African literature which does not transform the idea of world literature is perhaps not playing a central role. There are, of course, many answers to the question why African literature seems to be absent or to be excluded from the anthologies of world literature. There is, for example, the problem of what Ajahn Appadurai has called the hegemony of Eurochronology, the overdetermining power of typologies developed in relation to European experiences and texts, including the idea of literature itself. What this has meant, among other things, is that attempts to expand the canon of world literature always come up against the firewall of these typologies and the a priori assumptions that legitimize them. Note here that the problem is not Eurocentrism, but an unquestioned chronology that assumes a European time scale and denies the rest of the world coevenness, what Johann Fabian called the condition of shared time. So even the most well-intentioned projects of world literature seem to go around Africa looking for African texts to fill the typologies that they have established. And for some reason, African texts never seem to be good enough. So once upon a time, I heard Saul Bellow say during the Kashra War, some of you are old enough to remember those, "Give me the Tolstoys of the Zulus and I'll read him." Of course, that was a dead end because you can't produce a Tolstoy of the Zulus. But there is another dimension to the uneasy relationship between the idea of literature and the texts produced by others, or those considered to be others. If the idea of world literature is premised on the translatability of literary texts so that they can cross cultural and linguistic boundaries, we simply have no framework for dealing with texts that are global and multinational in their discursive formation, yet are premised on a singularity that's derived from specific locality and linguistic codes that insist on their untranslatability. And later in this presentation, I'll call attention to that very tricky relationship between the translatable and the untranslatable. Advocates of world literature seem to be afraid of texts that have provenance in other worlds, but still insist on the primacy of their own publics, and hence resist translation into the cultural idiom or paradigm of the assumed European or American center. If theories of world literature seem to have anything in common, it is the desire to calibrate literature and world within the logic of the same, of the European center, with occasional gestures to difference only to the extent that this difference affirms the dominance of the center. The texts that are admitted into the configuration of world literature are those that seem to retain and sustain not only the romantic idea of literature that was driving Goethe's project, but also a European center that remains undisturbed but by that which was meant to disturb it. And one of the things that I find particularly important in the African text, in its various iterations and representations, is, of course, its translatability, but also insistence on a dimension of opacity. African literature seems to present us with texts that have difficulty living up to the mandate of world literature because of a simultaneous insistence on intelligibility, but also opacity. Here we have a literature that is produced in the dominant European languages sometimes and European genres, and yet one that seems to short-circuit this imperial tradition, to overthrow it, to question its authority, and ultimately to point literature and its ideals into unexpected directions. I want to suggest that African literature puzzles because even when it appears to be deploying a very familiar vocabulary or to adopt established genres and conventions, it always introduces an element that seems to frustrate cultural and linguistic translation. So let me use a very famous example. In its very title and structure, Things Fall Apart gestures towards very familiar texts and words. Yeats' Second Coming, from which the title comes from, and of course the temporality of the tragic, which is apparent in Okonkwo's death at the end of the book. But I've always been intrigued by the fact that in this familiar idiom of Yeats and Things Fall Apart, of the tragic and its temporality, there's that that thing called chi that always seems to mess things up. And I've been intrigued, but this chi has been bothering me since I was 12 years old, so it's been there for a long time. What does this chi mean, and how do we translate it? I'll give you one of the examples there. I'll just read a little bit of it. Unoka was an ill-fated man. He had a bad chi, or personal god. An evil fortune followed him to the grave, or rather to his death, for he had no grave. He died of the swelling, which was an abomination of the earth goddess. And then later, the sickness was an abomination to the earth, and so the victim could not be buried in her bowels. He died and rotted away above the earth, and was not given the first or the second burial. Such was Unoka's fate. When they carried him away, he took with him his flute. And there's another example, of course, when Okonkwo meets the same destiny when things are not working out. Again, it's all explained by his chi. Now, you can imagine being in high school, reading the book to prepare for my O-levels and trying to figure out what this chi means, and the teacher always trying to translate it in very familiar idiom, saying, well, the chi has to do with destiny, it has to do with fate, and so on. And yet it remains untranslated. So obviously it's calling attention to another meaning, which is always excessive of all the accounts we can provide about it. We can see this problem actually, or this problematic throughout the works of Chinua Achebe. In Arrow of God, which draws on very familiar texts, C.K. Meek's Law and Authority in a Nigerian Tribe, Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson. But I would suggest that the uniqueness of the novel depends not so much on those familiar rewritings of the European text, but elements of Igbo culture that always seem to us untranslatable, at least in a linguistic and cultural sense. What, for example, is the meaning of that Ikenga, whose destruction triggers the war between Umwaro and Okperi and ends up handing the land over to colonial agents? It all starts at with a very localized dispute, but the untranslatable seems to point to larger metaphysical matters. So when I'm teaching this, obviously, I do what most teachers do. I'm trying to translate this Ikenga business to my students, and so I go to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia has some total nonsense about it. Total nonsense. And if you go to the Wikipedia definition of Ikenga, that's when you begin to realize that actually it's better if it were left unexplained. And of course, Achebe suggests that by leaving it untranslated, but he does something very important, which you see at the bottom of that quote, and that is when Ebo discovers that his Ikenga has been destroyed, we are told, still Ebo turned around and went into his obi. At his shrine, he knelt down to have a closer look. Yes, the gap where his Ikenga, the strength of his right arm had stood, stared back at him. An empty patch without dust on the wooden board. Nado, Nado, he wept, calling on his dead father to come to his aid. The word does not need to be translated for its meaning to come across. In fact, it's precisely because of those words, the nado, the sounds he makes as he weeps, that we begin to realize this Ikenga is serious business. You just don't go around messing it up. What is going on here? Where we expect explanations, we are thrown into the confusion of signs without signifiers, a jumble of words whose essence and gravity is apparent, but not their meaning. The tenor is carried by the sound surrounding the event, but the vehicle has been displaced. Other examples of this kind of untranslatables where we seem to be dealing with familiar texts exist in African literature. Consider, for example, another text, Semben Usman's Hala, which invites a discussion around very familiar topography. Several people here have written about, most notably Ken Harrow, about the fetish. But what exactly is this Hala? I struggle again to explain this. Well, it's because it's something more than impotence. To just say, well, Hala is impotence doesn't carry it. And there's something about the untranslated nature of it that becomes very important. Death and the King's Horseman depends on the self-willed death of Elassine Oba. You all remember that moment in a play when we are told he will die. He will just die. But how is he going to die? Well, he will just die. And if you taught the play again, you have to try and explain to the students. The students want a logical explanation. How is he going to die? Is he just going to be so depressed and upset and so on and so forth? And then you just have to go back to the play and say, he is just going to die, because that's it. Many examples. The structure of the Bildungsroman in Titi Dangareba's nervous condition revolves around the figure of Baba Mukuru, but how do we translate this name from Shona to English? Again, this one has troubled me for many years, because the younger brother is the one called Baba Mukuru. The younger brother is the one who functions as a paterfamilias. And then so you can only begin to understand what's going on in a novel if you adopt a very serious engagement with the terminologies and the thick description of the Shona culture and the etymology, which is being transformed by the changes engendered by colonialism. Because in Dangalemba's novel, the reason why the younger brother has become the paterfamilias is precisely because of his privileged position within the new colonial educational system. He's the one who takes care of the family. Now, these untranslatables often frustrate readers who are keen for a measure of commensurability, and they often resist incorporation into structures of paradigms that predate them. I can almost suggest, without having any empirical evidence, that when people who put together the anthologies of world literature embark on a task, one of the things that seems to provide problems to them is precisely these untranslatables, because to a certain extent, they are looking for an African text which is going to fit into a familiar paradigm. I could give some examples here, but I won't. I want to respect my hosts at Yale. Efforts to globalize African texts is often frustrated, but what appears to be the insistence of those texts on a metaphysics of locality, often at odds with the unquestioned cosmopolitanism of world literature. African texts seem to resist the imperative that they become world literature in a European sense of the word, or simply resist their interpellation into a field of play that's both familiar and alien. One reason for this resistance is the doubleness of the African text in relation to its audiences. In relation to its publics, as several scholars have shown, the African text is often striking because of its double play of extroversion and introversion. Eileen Julian has made the powerful claim that the African novel is extroverted. What African readers and readers beyond Africa think of typically as the African novel is a particular, and I leave some words there, a particular type of narrative characterized above all by its intertextuality with hegemonic or global discourses and its appeal to across borders. Yes, Eileen, I agree with all that. But amidst this extroversion, there's also much introversion. Consider this example from Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease. I think No Longer at Ease is one of the most extroverted novels in the African canon. The novel courts its readers, and it courts them by appealing to a very familiar vocabulary, T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi, which provides the title. And it even goes further by assuming a certain familiarity with the language of modernism and the global discourses surrounding it. Indeed, the text goes out of its way to align itself with modernism, and it stages a debate on how modern literature should be read. So, for Africans of a certain generation, there's no surprise that when Obi Okonkwo appears before the Public Service Commission, his interlocutor is, I quote, a fat, jolly Englishman who is, I quote, keen on modern poetry and the modern novel. It's not surprising that the enlightened conversation that takes place between the two, between Obi Okonkwo and the chair of the commission, revolves around a range of writers, modern writers, all the way from Graham Greene to Amos Tutuola. and that Obi uses the occasion to display his mastery of the modernist canon. So Obi is showing off because Obi went to England and decided to study English, much to the annoyance of the Umuafia Progressive Association, which had paid for his way there. They wanted a lawyer, not a literary person. Still, the familiar narrative of an Englishness that conjoins the departed colonial and the new African subject is complicated by an introverted cultural discourse and its surplus of meaning. In other words, certain elements in a novel have meaning only for very introverted audiences, if you want, more particularly Nigerian or Igbo readers. Or another way of putting this is to say that there are certain elements in that novel which are not familiar to all of us. The idea, for example, things you take for granted, the Umuofia Friendship Association. That's a very specific thing. Or my favorite example, again, I keep on going back to my childhood traumas, is Osu. The most obvious example of introversion in the novel is Clara's Osu, a term that remains untranslated throughout the book and is hence only available to us through the affect it creates. And again, for my O-levels, I had to struggle with this also business because I had to explain it. The question was, the O-level question many years ago was, why do you think that Krala's being an Osu is significant to the meaning of the book? Well, what is this Osu exactly? So here are several examples. I want to suggest that actually, again, the key to this term is not the translatability of it, but the way it resists translation. Why can't you marry me? This is Clara asking Obi. What's the matter, Clara? Tell me. He was no longer unruffled. There was a hint of tears in her voice. I'm an Osu, she wept. Silence. She stopped weeping and quietly disengaged herself from him. Still, he said nothing. So, you see, we cannot get married, she said quite firmly, almost gaily. A terrible kind of gaiety. Only the tears showed she had wept. So it's always very interesting that the untranslatable is always followed by these very powerful affects, which tell us actually what the untranslatable means through the effect it has. So Obi goes on to scream nonsense. We're going to get married anyway. So here, Osu evades translation, and Achebe prefers to leave it untranslated, or he lets other people mistranslate it. One of the interesting mistranslations in the book, of course, is when Obi's father tries to translate it, and he says, Osu is like leprosy in the minds of our people. What does that mean? And then he goes on to use very interesting language, biblical language there. We have other examples. I'll go through these quickly. This is Obi's mother and her reaction to it. Simply, she says that if you go ahead and marry this woman, I'm going to kill myself. Mother, he called as if he was going away. She held up her hand for silence. But if you do the thing while I'm alive, you'll have my blood on your head because I shall kill myself. She sank down completely exhausted. At this stage in the novel, the untranslatable has become the key to explaining the crisis of culture that defines the novel. And it's because of these untranslatables that certain things sometimes don't seem to fit. But I'm saying again, in our work, instead of trying to make things fit, we should actually be trying to understand why certain things don't fit. The things which don't fit, things such as the chi or the osu, are the things which are important because they mess up the familiar conversations we have been developing about what modern literature is all about. My argument, of course, and this is the second part of my paper, my argument, of course, that it's not our task to make texts fit into any register. Rather, our challenge is to establish a genealogy for the African text as a text that's both familiar and also different. To locate this text in the context that produced it and within the publics it imagined or willed into being, and to understand its function within the multiple worlds in which it found itself and the complex cultural formation that it represented, but also constituted. For I want to argue that at its moment of inauguration, modern African literature was not driven by the aspiration to become world literature, but to account for the place of the African in the world. It was in literature that the African was first imagined as worldly and, by implication, as a subject of the world, of being in the world and having a world. Many people here, at least people of my generation, became African before they became Kenyan or Ghanaian or Nigerian. And the reason for that was, again, this text that insisted on an imaginary configuration called Africa, in which dealt certain subjects who were called Africans, and those Africans belonged to a certain world. And one of the major achievements of the African text, at least in its foundational moment, was not only its ability to constitute the African in the world, but I would argue to have a sense of the changing context in which the literature was being produced, and to respond to that context in quite amazing linguistic gestures. So I want to use one text which performed that work. This is Okot Bitek's Song of Lawino. An African Lament was the way it was called, at least in the first edition. I want to suggest that the history of a poem such as Song of Lawino and its changing textual relationships is a clear indication of how African writers understood both literature and the world in that caesura that was to redefine African worlds, namely the period between late colonialism and decolonization. Quite an important foundational moment in the literary history of Africa. Taban Loliong speculates that the genesis of Song of Lawino dates back to 1949, when Okot Bitek was a high school student in northern Uganda. This was a period when Bitek was interested in the function of oral songs and their relationship to written poetry. The first version of the poem was written in the 1950s, and I believe, I haven't checked this lately, I believe a 1959 transcript is available, or was available, at the special collection of the University of Nairobi Library. I haven't checked this for years, so it could have found its way somewhere else. The first English edition and the second Asholi version of the poem were published in 1966 and 1969, respectively. The combined edition of Song of Lawino and Song of Oshol, intended for use in high schools, was published by the East African Publishing House in 1972. And we can definitively conclude that Bitek's poem entered global circulation with the publication of the combined edition of Song of Lawino and Song of Oshol by Heinemann Educational Books in its African Writers series in 1984. Now, you may ask, why are these dates important? If we pay close attention to the timelines, we will notice that what was most important about Song of Lawino was its attentiveness to its changed context and the poet's responsiveness to the desires of an evolving audience. So my main argument here is that when we track the translations and the different versions of that poem, we can already begin to see how a certain African text is responding to the context in which it finds itself as we move from the 1950s to the 1960s, as the author begins to think about different audiences while still also being very attentive to the metaphysics of locality, so to speak. Simply put, each edition of the poem was translated or retranslated to respond to the demands of a new reading formation. And I am particularly interested in how the poem was creating a new reading formation, because at the moment we are entering another important phase in the reformulation and the formation of African readerships, especially in several African countries. And so it's important to understand how readers not only desire certain forms of literature, but how certain forms of literature also produce audiences. Bitek conceived his poem and wrote the first Asholi version in the 1950s during the age of a dying colonialism, which was also an in-between period, what Hannah Arendt would describe as afterness, the empty space that marks the no longer and not yet. A dying colonialism had created a new context for rethinking African futures, but what these futures were, or what they would look like, was not always very clear. With the imminent death of colonialism, a new space had been opened for thinking about what V.Y. Mudibe has described as another center for African history and its ideological activities. Significantly, the new African literature emerging in the 1950s was taking place in an age of Kashra translation. In retrospect, Pitek's turn to poetry and poetics can be read as part of his attempt to respond to the series of questions raised by his teacher, the Oxford anthropologist Godfrey Linhart, on the possibility or impossibility of Kashra translation. One of the things, those of you who may not be familiar with the history of the poem, is that Okot Pitek in the 1950s put aside most of his poetic writing, postponed the translation of his novel Laktak, because he was interested primarily in the discourses of anthropology, religion, and so on, which he considered central to understanding the new emerging African culture. But Okot Pitek was never at home in those disciplines, and his interest in poetry would slowly emerge as a significant attempt to actually short-circuit those disciplines. So we see that the first version of Song of Lawino, written about the same time as Linhart's work on Kashra translation, was already itself trying to suggest new terms for thinking about the relationship of Africans and their languages and their traditions. One could go into that quite a bit. My argument is that the changing context of the poem can best be understood through an examination of the changes Pitek introduced into his poetic register and modes of address as his text moved from the colonial to the post-colonial public sphere. According to George Heron, Pitek introduced at least 3 major changes in his second Acholi version of the poem. First, the length of the poem was expanded from 30 typed pages to 140 printed pages. Okot was not trying to create an epic, but a lyrical sequence that would expand the range of references and reimagine his audience. And this is what I'm trying to emphasize, that the poem was already trying to reimagine its audience. It was not a poem which was just going to circulate to a mute audience. It was going to be an active agent in the making of those audiences and in the transformation of their desires. One consequence of this desire to transform audiences, was that Okot Pitek moved significantly from his meditation on what has come to be known as the Kit Achol, the ways of the Acholi, which was one of the major themes of the book, and he moved on, and I'll come back to this later, he moved on from a very specific Acholi discourse on identity to a discourse on blackness, which I'll come to in a moment, because I want to, to gesture towards a few interesting problems. So the first thing then Okot did is, of course, expand his poem to speak to a larger audience. The second thing he did in his revised version was to actually increase the satirical impacts of the poem. Those of you who remember the poem, remember that one of the central figures, the major object of satire, is Clementine. Clementine, Ochol is no longer in love with the old type. He's in love with a modern girl. The name of the beautiful one is Clementine. Brother, when you see Clementine, the beautiful one aspires to look like a white woman. This is in the new edition. It was not in the original. And one of the interesting questions that comes up is, why is it that after decolonization, satire and irony become quite important? We begin actually to see a fundamental shift from allegorical discourses to ironic discourses. And that, again, has to do with the audience, a post-colonial audience which could handle satire much more than their predecessors. And the third change Okot Pitek made to his expanded poem was, of course, he developed the figures of Lawino and Ochol as sociotypes rather than mere allegorical figures. In effect, Ochol and Lawino became embodied. They were no longer signs or signifiers of contrasting cultural positions, but subjects whom we recognized among us. As some of you may remember, cultural conversations, especially in East Africa, for most of the 1970s and 1980s, were essentially debates between the Lawinos and the Ochols. Goge talks about this in the preface to Okot Pitek's work on the African Cultural Revolution, but there are a few people here who remember those debates about who is the Lawino, who is the Ochol. My English teacher had returned from India with a nice BA from Delhi University, but he had married a village girl, so we used to call her Lawino. And, of course, we said the teacher had become Ochol. and so on. So there was a way in which, of course, the poem is already mediating cultural conversations. And even today, when you go to East African newspapers, you'll notice a lot of the use of Lawino and Osho. He is just another Osho, just overburdened by books. Now, in the paper, I'm going to skip a little bit. I go into very specific shifts in terms of the emphasis as the poem is trying to negotiate but also reimagine its audience, and as it tries to expand its referential range. Now, one of the most important changes the poem underwent as it was translated from Asholi to English is Okot Bitek cut out the last chapter. So the original Asholi and a few translations, like the more recent Luganda translation, include that last chapter. But the English and the French and the German and the Spanish editions, which rely on the English, even the Swahili edition, does not include the very last chapter. And that's very crucial, because what happened is that in the very last chapter of the poem, Okot Bitek had almost retreated from the cultural position he had established at the beginning. The last chapter is concerned with the idiom of the pumpkin, which I'll come back to in a moment. And that chapter is missing, and I want to reflect on what it means to have left out the most important chapter in the translations. What was he saying about the passage of the text across languages? From what I can tell, the translation of the poem from Asholi to English seems to mark an expansion of its referential range and, by implication, its audience. Taban Loliong complains, when he redid the translation, he complained that Bitek's own author's translation had pandered to non-Asholi readers, and that he had reduced or weakened the power of the original. In his preface to his own translation of the poem, Loliong complained that Song of Lawino, the English version, was not, I quote, strictly a faithful translation of Wa Palawino, but a rendering of the poem in which whatever was topical, striking, graphic, and easily readable into English received due prominence at the expense of the Asholi. But of course, my argument is this is what Okot Bitek intended. He intended to produce a text that would easily be rendered into other languages, and in the process conscript audiences outside his original geographic area. As a translator, Bitek preferred commensurability to incommensurability. He had, as he put it, clipped the wings of the Asholi version so that the text could travel into other worlds. And of course, this to me is an obvious example of how African writers were already sensitive to the different audiences they were catering to. He wants his translation to travel in other languages, travel among other audiences, and so he makes this compromise. In translation, of course, Song of Lawino began to travel around the world. It first traveled in East Africa through its English and Swahili translations, published in 1966 and 1975. With the publication of the poem in the African Writers Series, Song of Lawino entered the domain of what we now call post-colonial literature. By this time, the text had been translated into other European languages. That's the original Asholi with Taban Loliong's translation, which is actually closer to it. This is Okot Bitek's own translation, which is the one we are familiar with. This is where the poem ends, and the final chapter 14 is missing. This is the German translation, Lawino's Lied. The French translation, the Canson de Lawino, and Canciones de Lawino, the Spanish translation, and more recently, the translation into Kiganda by Abasi Kiyamba, Omulanga Ngwalawino. So the text was already traveling quite easily in translation. I'm not going into debates about why is it then that this text, which has traveled around the world, why is it that it's not going to be found in the major anthologies of world literature? And I went through many of them and I didn't find it. So I'm not going to go into that debate because I'm trying not to complain too much. What I want to end with is, again, go back to the problem of translation and untranslatability and pose the question, of course, of what the missing chapter meant. One of the things you'll notice was that Okot Pitek wanted a poem that would be easily recognizable. Let me dance before you, my love. Let me show you the wealth in your house. Or show my husband, son of the bull, let no one uproot the pumpkin. That's where it ends. And the pumpkin, of course, I'll come back to that in a moment. It's very important because the next chapter, the missing chapter, chapter 14, is all about the pumpkin, trying to contextualize it. But Okot Pitek somehow decided that was not necessary. But I want to suggest that the poet's concession to his non-Asholi readers contains a complication. Since translators of the final passage of the poem worked with the English rather than the Asholi text, they had no difficulties finding cultural or linguistic equivalent. So if you go through all the texts, if you go through the German, if you go through the French, and if you go through the Spanish, the pumpkin is there. There's no difficult finding a word for pumpkin, right, in any language. But that is a problem in one sense because the European language translators struggle with the pumpkin, not as a word, they struggle with the pumpkin as a concept. So all these translations have glossaries where you explain what this pumpkin business is all about. And you talk about its significance to Asholi culture. But I was struck by the fact that in many ways, the one translation that did not have anything to do with the pumpkin, left it out completely, was actually the Swahili translation. Now, as you see in the Gikandi translation, the pumpkin is there and in Suju, but look at the Swahili translation. Uone nikuchezee ngoma mpenzi wangu nikuonyeshe mali iliyomo katika nyumba yako. Osho mume wangu mwana wa dume asije mtu akaung'oa mboga. Now, boga, so as the Swahili speakers know, that's not a pumpkin. Boga is vegetables, generic. So it's no uproot the pumpkin, let no one. And the reason for that is when you go to the Gikandi translation, actually the translation in Suju makes sense because there's a cultural affinity where actually the pumpkin is also associated with the homestead among the Baganda, or at least some Baganda clans. In Dar es Salaam, where the Swahili text was produced, this business of the pumpkin would not make sense. So the one that makes sense, in order to bring forward the gravity of uprooting oneself from one's culture, was the mboga, because mboga is what we live on, the Sukuma Wiki, and so on and so forth. So the Swahili translation was not as sensitive or worried about it. It was not as anxious about that. Let me conclude then by noting that in many ways, in Okot Pitek's text, we have a text which the author was encouraging to travel through commensurable translations. But even then, there are always these little difficulties which emerged, and those are part of what I would call the untranslatable. But even when Okot Pitek went out of his way to expand the range of reference, there was always a problem. And the one I want to end with is the problem that happens through a very systematic introduction of a Pan-Africanist reference. In the poem, as it's translated into English, it shifts from, it's not about the ways of the Acholi, it's about the ways of black people. And there's an emphasis on that. Okot suggests that Acholi's problem is he's not proud of his culture, but this is not just Acholi culture, it's the culture of black people. But that runs into difficulties because what exactly then is the culture of black people? If there are black people for whom the pumpkin doesn't make any sense, then who's the audience here? And I remember dealing with this problem when I started teaching many years ago at Northwestern, and Goro Desai, who's somewhere in the audience, was a student in that class. And I was struggling to explain, of course, I had students who wanted and indeed identified with this Pan-Africanist element of the poem, but still were dealing with cultural elements which did not make sense. So one of the students I remember vividly asking, what's the problem with Clementine's makeup? Black women love makeup. And at that point, I knew I was in trouble. Thank you very much.
very happy to take questions. The microphone will come around here.
Thank you, Simon. That was, stimulating and rich. And I especially liked the reading of Lawino, and the move through the two versions, the two poems. I'm not sure I fully understand Mboga, frankly, but that's not the real question I have. What I think you're doing in the reading is offering the kind of thick description, the making of the context that permits us a lodging of African literature in the world. I'm very sympathetic to that. I think that's the way we should proceed as critics. What I guess I want to quibble with is your representation of Damrosch at the beginning, who says things that I agree with myself, but if I understand you correctly, you say African texts want to be read as literature, they have to be accepted as such. Damrosch is descriptive and not normative. His claim is that the text becomes a world text when others accept it. So he has no investment in it being genuinely global or multicultural or, and I think it's also worth remembering, you've checked anthologies more recently than I have, but I know that in the Longman anthology that he himself put out, you suggest that that Song of Lawino isn't in there, Song of Ashol neither, or the two. But so Mariama Ba is it in the first edition? It disappears. The kinds of things he has are things like Sarracine by Balzac, which is super well known in my opinion. So I'm not fighting with Damrosch, but I'm suggesting that he's someone who's not necessarily your ally, given what I think you're doing.
Oh, he's not my ally.
Well, okay.
One thing that was lost, as things get lost, one thing that was lost, actually, I was setting him up. In a sense, I was trying to suggest that, of course, these are projects which are driven by the desire to be democratic, inclusive, and to have the widest range of definitions, but in the end, they always stop somewhere. And one of the issues, I was trying to, but I guess I can't get away from it. I was irritated by a debate that took place when they started Yale NUS. Now, I know some of my students are teaching at Yale NUS, so I hope I'm not making your case difficult. But the argument then was that they looked all over, if you remember. They had the Gilgamesh, they had the Chinese epics, but they could not find an equivalent from Africa. And yes, I could have put it here, but and then they said, well, they had conversations about season of migration to the north, and things were apart, but they somehow, so we're still dealing with the so-bellow problem, right? So that's where I was coming from, but I didn't want to go into that. So that was at the very beginning. I'm sure they've changed. Of course, we all change. And so I was struck by two things I want to emphasize. One is the impulse is to define literalness in such a way that it opens up possibilities of other texts. But by the same token, you're right. It's that which others accept as world literature. So then we have to shift into the question of audiences. And I was suggesting, as the way Song of Lawino circulates within, at least I'll limit Eastern Africa, there's a way in which there's very specific Asholi text. And remember, Asholi is a minor language within East Africa. It's already being accepted by other people as a world text because it's already functioning very effectively outside its culture. So that's where the two parts of, that's why we have a bridge. Yeah.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I am Gift Nkam from Cameroon. Something just dawns upon me. Struggling to place African literature as world literature is like struggling to say Africa should be part of the world map on the atlas. And if that is the case, matching the conference theme with your presentation, should we rather be saying the conference should be striving at replacing Africa where it ought to be, rather than fighting the preeminence and the dominance of Africa and the might of African literature on the world map?
So my argument was that African literature should be read as a literature which has its own conceptions of the world. So we need to problematize the world just as we need to problematize literature. Because the idea of literature that drives discussions about world literature, obviously, is a romantic idea of literature. The idea of the world that drives this literature is also a very strange idea, because I could argue that the Acholi culture that produced Okot text poem saw itself as a world. And when it was translated more recently, that's why I loved, and I wrote about this a little bit, I loved the translation of Song of Lawino into Luganda because of the politics, the geopolitics of it, because Luganda, that's another world. And when we translate it, we keep on, of course, having these expansive notions of the world. So I was suggesting simply that instead of us trying to figure out which African texts fit into a model of world literature that has already been established by others, we should be asking, how does African literature question those models of African literature? So that's what I was pushing for. That the reason why the readings become important, the reason why the languages become important, is precisely because they enable us to resist the impulse. I know we function in institutional settings where at the moment the only way literature departments are going to survive, we saw this in Complete a few years ago, is by, of course, becoming departments of world literature. And of course, we don't want to be left out of it. I don't want us to be left out of it. I don't want unemployed Africanists. so obviously. So I understand the political impulse, but I'm also saying within those configurations, our task is to actually use the evidence presented to us by the text to question the very ideas that are being pushed for us. Otherwise, we'll be waking up like we've done before and discovering actually it was not good for us. There was a time when we had African linguists in language departments. Now I tend to find them in anthropology where they were exiled, and so on. So that's what I was trying to push back against.
Thank you so much, Simon. I'm looking at the terrain that you've been mapping for us, and I'm wondering if Things Fall Apart, A Song of Lawino, are the texts in which you are finding a world within these texts, and whether the world can be found in contemporary African literature, and what has happened between that era and now, because it's a very, very specific range of texts that perhaps all of us regard as our origins, but you've not come any closer to where we are now. And does the question of the world change if you do make that journey?
So 2 points. One is my talk is actually not so much part of a project about world literature per se. I'm trying to ask a simple question, and that is, why do certain texts emerge in Africa at a particular moment in this very vexed relationship to African languages? And this text I start with actually is not Things Fall Apart. That comes much later. The one I've spent quite a bit researching is El Inkishafi, which is a Swahili poem from the North Coast, which is in Arabic script, and of course, very influential poem. It's about the fall of the Omani dynasty on the East African coast. And that poem alone right there raises the question of what's the world? It's a lamentation about the fall of the world, but what is the world for the Omani, the exiled Omanis? So there's that part to it. The second part I'm interested in is the changing relationship between writers and audiences. That we can do a literary history where we can move all the way from where you want to start up to the present, to the 21st century, and see the changing notion of the world as itself, of course, a major preoccupation. That's what most contemporary transnational African writing is doing. And it's driven by something I maybe went too quickly over, and that is an African world that's not only constantly expanding, but even as it expands, it's still connected to what I'm calling metaphysics, after Padre, a metaphysics of the local. So there are different African ways of dealing with the world. So what struck me as very interesting, if you look at a transnational Kiganda novel, or a Igbo writer writing in English from Washington, D.C. or New York, or Alabama, or a Ghanaian writer in Alabama, there's a way in which you begin to see a certain sets of intersections, not only of the local and the global, the simple one, but I was quite intrigued when Giassi in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, this was a story about African writers from Alabama. So what does it mean? And that Southern identity is as important to it as another world, and that is, of course, the world of whether it's Ghana. I remember once asking Tai Selassie, what of these worlds is the most significant to you? What is it? And I expected her to talk about the Afropolitan, talk about those things. Well, she said the most important word for her, I was surprised, was the Yoruba. Yoruba, the Yoruba of her mother, even more than the word of her father or the word of her education. So there are many ways in which these novels are staging debates about what the world is. But of course, I'm arguing, of course, as a literary historian, that those debates have been staged by other texts also, within different shifting contexts.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for, as usual, a very illuminating set of observations. I have a number of things, but the main thing I want to say is that I think there is something more pernicious than Damrosch and company or behind their decision not to include African literary texts in the big anthologies. And I think it is actually ignorance. That's why I say it's more pernicious. So as a scholar, if the worst accusation is to be accused of ignorance. And the reason why I say ignorance is that you and I know that we can dilate on Shakespeare and Sophocles, but also on Achebe. Many of these world literature people cannot dilate on anything except what is within the confines of the Western tradition. Therefore, there are two tasks, I think, at hand. First is that Africa, because to ask that we be included is really important, and I think we ought to be included, but it's also to ask that we be included within a framework that already exists, to be enframed within the Euro chronology, which is how they would put us in there. So the first task is, of course, to continue to ask to be included, but the second task is for us to take on the responsibility of defining world in our own terms. So we define world, and then we define world literature in African terms. Because to define world, and that's world literature in African terms, is to strike up an alliance with Baldwin or Native American writers or Zadie Smith. And in fact, there's enough material from these so-called minority writers to create a viable sense of the world with, obviously, there will be references to the West, because these writers, as you rightly noted in African literature, are always extroverted. But there's enough material for us to define a world from an Afrocentric perspective. Now, this world, once it is defined, once we begin to seriously do the work of defining it, will have to be, there's a kind of a reluctant acknowledgement that will take place. So we don't need to wait for people like, Bloom. Harold Bloom writes this big, compendium on world literature, and there's no, I think he concedes Achebe in there somewhere, or Terry Eagleton's Sweet Violence on tragedy. In fact, I'm working on tragedy. Of all the big writers on tragedy, modern, Terry Eagleton, name them, there's not a single reference to an African text, not even in passing. Even Achebe does not feature in Eagleton's Sweet Tragedy, that's the book. So that's what I'm saying. We can begin to define world. It's a very laborious task in a way that starts from how we see it and how we experience it.
Yeah. So I agree with that. A part of the paradox, obviously, and I've talked about this for years now. The paradox of the production of African knowledge in Western institutions outside Africa. I know Teju has provided a critique of this when I've said. Maybe it's nostalgia, Teju, but I still remember one brief moment where the resources of defining that world, the stuff which could be published, which cannot be published anymore. Can you imagine someone publishing a whole volume in this country on Injala poetry, right? So the paradox is, on one hand, institutionally, of course, I want us to be included and have to fight and insist on that inclusion. And the issue then that is, we have to fight on the terms of inclusion, and that's where we have to, as you rightly said, redefine the world. And one way of redefining that world is to use these tremendous resources we have, because one of the things now we have, when you go now into the archive itself of African literature, it's just staggering. It's a huge archive. And of course, the linguistic resources. One way of traveling the world is to ask simple questions. What does the world mean in this particular language? There are hundreds of languages represented in Africa and with expertise. And the final point I would say is, I think we need to fight much more and to work harder and to develop alternative institutions for promoting and, to a certain extent, circulating those texts which have been excluded, because sometimes they are the most important. The ones which are included easily are sometimes the ones which are translatable. But what about the ones that resist that kind of translation? Yeah, we have to do that.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I don't know your definition of the word world and world literature. I didn't think that the world meant America or Europe. It meant a number of countries, villages, towns, and what have you. Yes, because of the way that colonialism and empire building was constructed. Most of us who come from Africa were regarded as people who didn't have a culture or civilization or languages. And we went by it. But as time went on, we fought. Africans became independent. They developed their own languages. And I'm sure you know what we Africans call the Caliban motif in literature. We do not write in English because we enjoy writing in English, but we have to write in English so that the English-speaking person will understand us. You've talked about problems of translation. I think when you say that, you are forgetting the fact that some of us who studied either here in Nigeria, in Europe, have learned how to express ourselves in foreign languages. We know about criticism. Take, for instance, you talk about Achebe, you have talked about the meaning of chi and so on and so forth. But you forgot that there are people who have made a lot of research which have tried to explain the exegesis of some of the cultural things that the white people cannot understand. So it is not something new. If anybody wants to understand any written text from Africa, he has to work hard. The way that I worked hard to understand the world of Shakespeare. Fortunately, here is Professor Lindfors, a very well-renowned worker in African literature. He established RAL, Research in Our African Literatures. And through that journal, the world of literature from Africa opened. I was a student of his. He taught me how to do it. But I have written books. If you want to know about the cultural elements and things fall apart, go to my one of my books, Understanding Things Fall Apart. It's read all over. You want to know about the novels and the cultural elements, go to God's oracles and divination. If you go into that book, she will be explained. So let us not pretend that we have to plead before we are included in world literature. Thank you.
Yes. So my only response to that, of course, is we have to work very hard.
Please join me and thank Dr. Gikandi for this exciting paper, you know. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you.